right, so this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 1, Section 3, West Africa and the Role of Slavery. So when beginning with U.S. history, we've essentially already looked at a couple of areas. The first one, and the first section was, and we'll put right here, 1.1, was looking at the Americas. The second section, 1.2, was Europe. And now, section 1.3, we're going to focus a little bit on Africa. And, this idea of the societies and cultures of the Americas, the societies and cultures of Europe, and then the societies and cultures of Africa coming together to really create what we call the Atlantic world, which is that world that borders the Atlantic Ocean. And it includes all three of these factors here. And so at the beginning of your textbook, you see that illustrated by this image here, right? The Americas, Europe, and Africa. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about Africa, specifically Western Africa, because Western Africa is where most of the people from Africa arrived to the New World by. Geographically speaking, we'll go ahead and use a different color here. West Africa is this region right in here. There is a river, I believe the Niger River, that runs roughly through this area, kind of in a U shape. And it's that river there that provides the basis for agriculture and civilizations and societies. So because there's a very rich farmland in this particular region, it's not too hot like the Sahara Desert above it. It's not too tropical like sub-Saharan Africa below it, but right sort of in this area, you have a more mild climate that allows you to grow agriculture and really thrive as civilization. So in Western Africa, again, roughly speaking, most people were polytheistic or animistic, and we've already come across that term. But we've already talked a little bit about the development of Islam in the 600s and 700s and the way that that spread, and we'll go ahead and use green here to indicate that, the way that that had spread through Northern Africa and through Saudi Arabia. Now, Islam arrives in Western Africa via traders, right? So traders who cross the Saharan Desert bring that religion with them. And so when we look at Western Africa in terms of Islam, many of the merchants and rulers are in fact Islamic, while most of the population has polytheistic beliefs related to the natural world. We talked about the role of agriculture. So this is a part of the globe where there is civilization. And by that, we essentially mean permanent structures, governments, things that you can't develop in a gathering and hunting society due to everybody needing to be on the move. So permanent societies in Western Africa. In terms of society and culture, most people are organized into villages. This is often connected to kin. Kin is extended family or family groups. And what was practiced in some parts of Western Africa and in the Islamic world was polygamy. And that was the practice of having more than one wife. More than one wife, polygyny, culturally speaking, that particular region. And so in Western Africa, you had from the period approximately 900 CE or 900 Common Era through about 1500 CE, when the European Age of Exploration begins, you had a series of very powerful empires located in Western Africa. And you want to be able to identify the three of them. So we have the Ghana Empire, the Mali Empire, and the Songhai Empire. And they go in that order: Ghana, Mali, Songhai. If we go back to the map here, you can see them, right? Here's Ghana. I'll use a different color. Ghana Empire, the Mali Empire, and lastly the Songhai Empire, all located along this riverbed because there's a lot of food to be produced there, and that allows for a more sophisticated division of labor, meaning people can do other things besides farm, right? That's really where those empires thrive. Like I mentioned before, Ghana, Mali, Songhai, for the most part, these thrive due to trade. These are predominantly, at least in terms of the ruling class, Islamic empires. For Ghana, gold and salt was incredibly important. Arab and Berber traders crossed the Sahara Desert. So again, using perhaps a color here that's going to be a little bit easier to see, so we'll use purple. So Arabs come from the Arabian Peninsula here. Berbers are in fact nomadic people, so these are people who have no farming, right? So they're constantly on the move. Berbers are mostly located in northern Africa in this particular region, and both Arab and Berber traders make their way across the Sahara Desert to trade with the Ghana Empire. And it was the ability for the Ghana rulers to monopolize the salt trade, to monopolize the gold trade, to convert to Islam, which is not only the ruling class there. We certainly also want to identify the merchant class as well, right? Many of these traders. Perhaps at the height of West African rule was the Mali Empire and Mansa Musa, who was the ruler. Mansa Musa is one of the richest people ever. Very wealthy ruler of the Mali Empire here in Western Africa. And one of the practices, and Mansa Musa himself was a practicing Muslim, and one of the requirements to be a good Muslim is to at least attempt, but if you're somebody like Mansa Musa and you have the resources, it's expected that you make the Hajj. And the Hajj is the holy pilgrimage to the holy city of Mecca. And so when Mansa Musa, and we'll use gold to illustrate how rich he was, when Mansa Musa made his pilgrimage, passing through Cairo, Egypt, to Mecca, which is somewhere in here, he had so much gold with him that it was said that he devalued the price of gold in Egypt because he was so wealthy. And so he's a good example to show how wealthy the Mali Empire was. Timbuktu was a center of learning and scholarship. It is a city. If we think about it in terms of geographically located, it's right at the top of this river bend here. And it was a place for knowledge, scholarship, especially related to religious scholarship there, Timbuktu, the city. And then lastly, the Songhai Empire, which was more of we might call them a little bit more geared towards warrior classes. All of these empires thrived up until about the 1500s, and what brought an end really to these empires in Western Africa was the introduction of gunpowder and gunpowder weapons from Europe, specifically Berber traders who came with gunpowder weapons and were essentially able to push who at the time was the latest of the empires, the Songhai Empire. But it's roughly about this time, the 1500s, that the Portuguese are beginning to set up some of their factories over here in the West, right? The Portuguese are starting to trade in these particular regions, right? In those particular regions. So in terms of the relationship between Africa and the New World, one of the major aspects of it is the role of Africa in the slave trade and the role of slavery specifically in the New World. And so when we look at historic slavery and slavery that was practiced in other places like Africa and look at slavery in the New World, there are some comparisons to make. There's some similarities and differences. If we look at just slavery per se, historic slavery, it's true that practically every civilization practiced slavery at some point in time. You know, the Romans did it, the Greeks did it, the Athenians did it. It's nearly a human universal. And at the time of, the 1500s, when Portuguese explorers are beginning to arrive, you do have slavery that exists within Africa, but it was a little bit different in terms of how it's going to be portrayed in the New World. Ways in which people most likely found themselves enslaved was either being POWs, which stands for prisoner of war. So if you were captured on the battlefield by your enemy, you would be turned into a slave. Or if you owed debt, or if you were a criminal. right? These were some of the ways that people were enslaved in Africa. However, when it came to the New World, slavery was much more in line with what we call chattel, and that is the idea that humans aren't necessarily people, but they are rather property. They're property, and slavery is inheritable, and it's a lifetime sentence, right? This is the most common way that slavery is practiced in the New World, that people are considered property. Slavery is an inheritable condition. So if your mother was a slave, then you were a slave, and that slavery is a lifetime condition. That wasn't necessarily the way that slavery was practiced in Africa in the 1500s. In fact, in some cases, slaves could assimilate into kin groups. So after a certain period of time, you would sort of assimilate into that particular tribe or that particular society. Now, in terms of the trade, the slave trade, that is the buying and selling of people, before the Portuguese arrived, and I'll go ahead and kind of make Portuguese factories here. Again, Portugal is located here. Let's go ahead and get green for Spain. Spain's located in this area. As we know, the Spanish went this way, right, and claimed, the New World. So this is all essentially Spanish territory, and that the Portuguese essentially went east, right? The Portuguese had their trade going this way, and the goal at the time, in the early days of the age of exploration, of course, was to reach India and Asia and to get those trade goods, but the Portuguese created trading posts along the way. In terms of the slave trade, historically, before this Atlantic world developed, slaves from Western Africa were brought to the Middle East, right, to Arabia. But slaves were pretty much brought from all around the world. You had a lot of slaves that were brought from Eastern Europe, especially when there were a lot of wars between the Islamic and the Christian world. And so a slave trade had already existed, much like the trade of all other commodities, in the old world prior to the age of exploration. So this Arab slave trade is the buying and selling of people prior to the development of the Atlantic world, 1492, which is a very important year. It was the Portuguese who brought the very first slaves from Africa into the New World, even though most of the New World was controlled by, in fact, Spain. One thing that was accurate about Portuguese involvement in the New World was that the Treaty of Tordesillas actually gave Portugal parts of Brazil. And by the time that you get to the English arriving, the French arriving, the Dutch arriving, they too have, colonies in these places, around the Caribbean. And the very first, or some of the first African slaves were brought to the New World to grow sugar. And so you really want to make a connection between sugar and slavery. Sugar was grown in Brazil, sugar was grown in the Caribbean, and so many of the very first African slaves arrived to the New World on Portuguese ships in order to grow sugar, which was a highly lucrative and profitable crop, but also very labor intensive and difficult to work with. So you essentially needed slaves to work on sugar because it was so difficult. And it was in the New World where you developed a race-based slavery system. This didn't happen overnight, but rather happened gradually. And we'll talk more about specifically the development of slavery in the English colonies and how it relates to the history of the United States. But if we're looking at the larger Atlantic world, there was a transition that occurred from Indian slaves, right, and encomienda, to African slaves. And two of the reasons why that transition occurred, and so this was true in the Portuguese colonies, this was true in the Spanish colonies, this was true in the English colonies, that for the most part, those colonies transitioned from Indian labor to African labor, mostly for two reasons. Africans were immune to diseases. Africa was connected to the old world, and so when pandemics and epidemics like the Black Death ravaged places like Europe, it had spread all throughout the old world. And so whereas Indians and Native Americans were dying of diseases, Africans were not. It was also considered more acceptable to enslave Africans because of religious reasons. Native Americans, especially in terms of Spain, were seen as potential Catholics. Africans were essentially um, considered to be Muslims and therefore more acceptable to enslave, given the history between Christianity and Islam, given the history of the Reconquista, given the history of the Crusades. And even though it wasn't, even though in reality being Christians enslaved other Christians, that was certainly true, this was much more acceptable. And for these two reasons, combined with the development of race-based slavery, you see a different type of slavery develop in the Atlantic world.